Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Pamela, welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
Well, I'm really interested in diving into this topic because you have a lot of things that I like of biographical stories, but then also understanding how history is constructed and how we can sometimes look and see how it's crafted in a way that tries to lead us away from what really happened. So we'll get into all that. But I want to start off by asking, what initially got you into this project and inspired you to do this book?
You know, I've been interested in the topic forever at some level, but I really didn't get a feel for just how many women warriors there were until I read Antonia Fraser's Warrior Queens, which came out in 88, 89, I believe. And in that, she introduced me to women I'd never heard of before. That ended up being kind of a kick in the head for me. And once I had that idea, I really started seeing examples a lot. So I started just collecting the stories. I ended up having a really fat file folder and didn't do anything with them for a long time. And then we reached a point where it seemed like I wasn't the only person anymore who was interested in women warriors. It seemed like we were seeing them certainly at the popular culture level in a new way. And it seemed time to start sharing those stories.
How would you define women warriors? What does that mean, that term?
I started out with a really simple definition, which was just women who literally fought, women for whom battle was not a metaphor. You know, that's a great starting place. As I got into the book, it was clear that it wasn't sufficient, particularly when I started dealing with the question of commanders, because, you know, if you're talking about a woman who's actually on the front line, it's pretty clear whether she's fighting or not. Commanders can be everything from a woman with a sword in her hand leading a charge to, you know, a woman in a girly uniform giving high morale to the troops. So I did spend some time coming down with where, you know, the idea of a combatant commander, someone who's actually with the troops, working on strategy, working on tactics, giving orders, so that as far as commanders were concerned, that's what I meant by woman warrior. The other reason I used the word warrior, though, was I quickly became aware that you needed to have a distinction between a warrior and a soldier. Because unlike men who fight, women who fight are frequently fighting in an irregular form. Only in a few times and places are they soldiers, in that they're part of a regular organized army. Sometimes that's earlier than we expect, but so some warriors are soldiers, but not all women warriors are soldiers.
Well, let's look at some examples and then circle back into this conceptually, because I'm very intrigued by this. You have a lot of different examples across different time periods, and I think that's part of your thesis, that you see women warriors in almost every place in time, whether they're defending their homes, their families, or supporting a political cause. What's one of the most ancient examples that you saw from history as an example of a woman warrior?
Well, the earliest woman whose name and story we know, Shang Dynasty, China, which is about 1200 BCE, is Fu Hao. She was one of the major wives of the Emperor Wu Ding, but she also was a landowner in her own right, and she was a successful military leader. And she's fascinating for the ancient world because so often we only know ancient warriors from sources that are written long after the fact and are often written by the enemies the women fought. Ancient primary sources are always problematic just from the passage of time. When you're dealing with ancient sources about women, you often have to adjust for bad attitude. But in the case of Fu Hao, we know her from sources that were not intended as sources. They're honest to goodness primary sources in the purest sense of the word. because they are from inscriptions on oracle bones, which were literally bones and sometimes tortoise shells that were used in divination. And they're the earliest Chinese written records that we have. And about 250 of those oracle bones refer to Fu Hao, often, sometimes in terms of health, but generally in terms of her going into battle. And, they weren't intended as a narrative, so they have to be pieced together. The way people piece them together doesn't always come up with the same chronology. But what's absolutely clear from them is she fought in almost every major campaign in Wu Ding's reign. And in fact, in occasion, she seems to have not just led her own troops, but to have been the ancient Chinese equivalent of a task force commander, where she's in a campaign in charge of other generals who are leading their forces under her command. So she is one of the earliest we know. And actually, the thing I find really fascinating is not just her story, but that we know of at least another 100 women whose names we have from those oracle bones who also fought in the Shang dynasty. We don't know anything about them other than that their names and they fought, but she clearly wasn't just by herself.
Yeah, I forget if it's Herodotus or what Greek writer talks about the Amazons as this female warrior contingent. And I've heard some historians argue that, well, the horse nomads of Central Asia, the Scythians, as they were called, had female warriors, so this could have turned into a legend of the Amazons. But from what you understand, at least in China, what are explanations that people have for why there would be female warriors as opposed to other civilizations where they would not have had these?
I don't know that we even get arguments about why. Actually, it's true even with Fu Hao. We tend to get women who fight in China in times of national crisis. So that we see, and China's fascinating because we don't think of China as a place that would create women warriors. But in fact, there is a long tradition. Fu Hao is simply the earliest. And over again, it's at a time of national crisis. It's at a time of unrest. Northern invaders are coming, as the northern invaders so often do in China. And in fact, Fu Hao is dealing with nomadic invaders from several directions when she's leading the armies. So they come in times when China, however it's defined at the time, is being invaded. They come at points at which a dynasty is being overthrown. So for instance, the Princess Ping Yang, she ends up pulling together a rebel army and leading it on behalf of her father at the end of she helps found the Tang dynasty. She's overthrowing the dynasty that's before that, only 2 or 3 rulers, very short dynasty. So that's when we're finding women in China. And that's often when we're finding women, is in times of crisis, whether it's at a very local level or a national level. If it's revolution, if it's throwing out a foreign invader like Joan of Arc, whether it's the revolutions of the early 20th century, where they're beginning to overthrow the European colonial empires. We get women in those armies. So national crisis seems to be one common indicator across history. It's not the only one, but...
Right, and going into another episode in Ancient History, when I mentioned the Amazons, do you know much about theories of who they could have been? I haven't read too much, but do you know what historical origins that could be based on?
The general theory is, in fact, the Scythians, where we certainly know that they were a nomadic people. There is a long history of them having women who ride, who shoot, who fight. And in fact, the earliest evidence that we have of a woman warrior comes not from the Scythians, but from before that, from about the 2nd millennium BCE, where there is in the Eurasian steppes a burial mound that included women with the kinds of grave goods that we typically associate with warriors. And those women actually have the kind of wounds that we associate with battles. So you don't get any of this, it's a ceremonial weapon. She didn't use it to fight. Maybe it's a kitchen implement kind of discussion that you so often get with so-called male grave goods with a woman. So there's a long tradition of women warriors in that part of the world, and Scythians seem to be the go-to explanation for the Amazons.
Yeah, it's interesting. I can almost see some similarities with, let's say, a Scythian female warrior and let's say, a riflewoman with the Red Army in World War II, in that the weapons and form of warfare you're using have force equalizers. If you're on a horse, it really doesn't matter whether you're male or female. Archery, that can make a difference, but the biological differences between men and women aren't as pronounced in that type of warfare as if you were, say, a Greek hoplite, where you're like practically pushing on someone. So what are theories that some would explain that in Scythian culture you would see more female warriors? I mean, part of it could be just the types of tactics used, but would some people say in steppe nomadic culture the gender lines aren't as rigid, or what would be explanations for that?
I just don't know. That's the both the glory and the problem of doing a global history is that at some level you have to refer to other experts. And if you want to push that story further, the woman you should get on this show is Adrienne Meyer, who wrote The Amazons, which is a book of myth and reality of women warriors in the ancient world. And she is fabulous, and that book is fabulous. What I do know is, in fact, nomadic cultures and tribal peoples in other places, not just in Scythia, also tend to be more welcoming, more approving of women warriors, or at least have a tradition of women warriors more readily than organized states and regular armies. So some of it is a different relationship between men and women within those societies, I think. Much less simple duality of what men and women do, I guess, is the answer to that.
Right. With this time period in history, someone who was part of a large state is it pronounced Canaan? Alexander's older half-sister? Kinane. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, tell me about her. I'm really interested in her story.
Well, I mean, number one, Alexander the Great has an older half-sister who fought, and she doesn't make it into the mainstream story. And she's part of a big empire, absolutely. She's also tied to those Scythian roots. Her mother was a princess from the Scythian territories. She grew up with all of the skills of what, for want of a better term, we'll call a warrior princess. She's from a culture where noble women ride, hunt, shoot. And by shoot, obviously, we're meaning arrows, not rifles. And she makes sure her daughter learns those same skills. So at the same time that Alexander's learning to be a warrior, presumably from Philip, Kinane is learning to be a warrior from her mother. She becomes a commander in her own right in her teens. She leads troops for Philip into the Eurasian steppe area. Before she's 20, she has conquered territories. She has defeated at least one major Scythian army, which ends up being fascinating because it may be the only battle in history that we know of where the commanders on both sides were women. She defeated the queen on the other side in hand-to-hand combat. And then Alexander comes to power. And he puts to death pretty much any of his male relatives who might be a threat to his rule. That includes Kinane's husband, who was a cousin. And she retreated from public life. Then after Alexander's death, the empire goes up for grabs. And one way to gain power, if you're a woman, is to marry into power. So Kinane leads out troops again with the purpose of trying to force the marriage of her daughter with the next Philip, who is Alexander's half-brother, also Kinane's half-brother, who has been damaged. He is not quite functional. So he's on the throne, but whoever controls him is going to control the throne. Her idea is that she will marry her daughter to her half-brother, and will become the power behind the throne. The generals who are in charge at the time